disinformation has always been there in our politics. Remember the Zinoviev letter of 1924. But I think, shall we say, one way of putting it, maybe we could do with a few more gentlemen in our politics and rather fewer players.
Zooming out, big picture, John, the British public have given up on. They think everything's broken and they don't think anyone can do anything about it. Trust in the state to sort out our problems at an all-time low. This is pretty bad, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a fairly depressing picture. Of course, in a sense, it's a reflection of the fact that the last 5 years have been 5 very difficult years because of the pandemic, the Russian-Ukraine war. But, we have had, the worst public health crisis in a century, the biggest inflationary spiral since the 1970s, the worst labor unrest since the 1970s. And the health service levels of dissatisfaction, waiting lists are at a record high. So we certainly shouldn't be surprised that the public think that there is difficulties with the country. But sure, in a sense, what seems to have happened is that in the wake of the eventual resolution of the Brexit stalemate of 2019 certainly helped to undermine our trust and confidence in government, much as the MP's expenses scandal had done beforehand. Indeed, before that, the whole argument about back to basics back in the 1990s when sleaze surrounded John Major's government. But in the wake of the delivery of Brexit, at least those voters who had voted leave in the 2016 referendum went, finally our politics are working. Indeed, for the first time, leave voters, those who were skeptical about the European Union, had more trust and confidence in how Britain was being run politically than were Remainers. Whereas historically, it's tended to be the other way around. Well, unfortunately, because Brexit, either taking on your view, either hasn't delivered or has been born in unfortunate circumstances, and therefore it's been very difficult to demonstrate that it's delivered, that Leave voters who now think that Brexit has not stopped immigration are now more doubtful about the economic consequences. Basically, the rise in levels of trust and confidence that was clearly there after the last election, that has just simply been reversed. And meanwhile, those who voted Remain are still pretty much as pessimistic as they were. And you put all this together, we've now got a situation, 45% of us, for example, say that we almost never trust governments to put the interests of the country above those of their own party. We've got 58% of people saying they almost never trust MPs to tell the truth, whether in a tight corner. And nearly 80% of us think that the way the system of government needs changing. These are either at or exceed previous record highs. Of course, I guess also one other reason why the public may feel this way, of course, is that the last 5 years have also been politically somewhat turbulent, not least inside the Conservative Party.
And the fact it's record highs, because some people say, well, no one's ever trusted politicians.
Sure.
There was never a halcyon days. But there's clearly, you're right, if you wanted to create the circumstances for a normal person to lose faith in the political process, you could have a big constitutional row, a big health crisis, a big economic crisis, and then a big political crisis. And you throw them all together. So there are lots of reasons to feel like things aren't working.
Yeah, absolutely. But certainly, I've already mentioned how the difficulties with Brexit, or the apparent difficulties with Brexit, have played a role. It's also the case, perhaps not surprisingly, that the many people who are dissatisfied with the state of the health service, they're much less likely to trust politicians, much more likely to think we need to reform government. Now, you're right, particularly when it comes to trusting politicians to tell the truth. We've always been somewhat doubtful. It's just that our doubts are now more widespread. And certainly, if you go back to the 1970s, it's quite striking. Despite the difficulties we then had as a country, as already mentioned, inflationary spiral, labour market unrest, an election about who governs in February 1974, actually at that stage, we were fairly evenly divided in our views about whether or not our system of government needed a great deal of improvement or not. So one has to say that we are, it isn't just circumstances, clearly, that can explain all of this. It's part of the story, but given that in the 1970s we weren't quite so gloomy about our politics, there is definitely a new ingredient in the mood that we've got at the moment.
Has there been a shift towards statism or big statism post-pandemic, where we saw those interventions, whether it was furlough, literally telling us where we could and couldn't go, the
Yeah.
sense that the government, the state would be there. Has that meant that we expect more from the state and are therefore even more dissatisfied, disenchanted when they doesn't deliver?
Well, I think that is probably one of the $64,000 questions about the last 5 years. British social attitudes asks a question regularly, all the way back to its first survey in 1983, which asked people, what do you think the government should do if it has to choose? Should it reduce taxation and spending on things like health, education, and social benefits? Should it keep them as they are, or should it increase them? Now, the honest truth is, very few people ever say reduce, although actually we've got about 1 in 10 people saying that at the moment. But what's been true in the past has been a very clear dynamic. So in the years of Margaret Thatcher and John Major, we gradually became increasingly concerned about the state of our public services, although not necessarily to the level we're at the moment. And the public were on balance saying, sometimes in the run up to 97 election, around 3/5 of us saying, actually, we think we should increase taxes and spending. New Labour actually didn't believe this evidence. I can well remember New Labour politicians saying, I know what they tell British social attitudes, but frankly, we don't believe them. But eventually, about 2 years into office, after they kept to Ken Clarke's quite tight tax and spending plans, New Labour did start open up the spending. They did indeed increase taxes. They increased national insurance. And the health service was satisfaction grew very tremendously. Well, the schools were much better. And of course, however, the public tend to be a fickle lot. So that expansion of the state did eventually get a reaction, i.e., people were saying, well, great, schools are better, health, hospitals are better. Could you now please taxes not quite so much? And so and that together with the financial crisis, you saw the reaction. Now, the interesting thing about this point, which of course has seen a record increase in taxation and spending, the state's now taking about 45% of the economy as opposed to a little under 40%. Despite that, the reaction at the moment, at least, is muted. Now, it's true that back in 2019, 53% of people saying we should increase taxes and spending. It's slipped now to 46, but given the size of the expansion of the state, that 46 number still looks rather high, and it's much higher than the 31% that it was towards the end of the last Labour government. Now, there are two explanations. One is the short-term one, which is that basically the state of the health service is regarded as being so bad that until that is sorted, the public don't regard tax cuts as the priority. The other possibility, which you've mentioned, is that maybe the pandemic has been like war. War has seen that both World War I and World War II are the two occasions when we've seen the two previous big expansions of the role and scope of the state. Has the experience of the pandemic with the state rescuing the labour market also increased our appetite for a bigger state? Now, I don't think we'll know the answer to this question for 5 years, but it does, as it were, raise interesting questions about the extent to which our politicians in this election campaign have been fighting over tax cuts when apparently it's the state of the health service, it's the state of social care that perhaps for at least a half of the public is still the priority.
I suppose there's a difference between the public being dissatisfied with this prime minister or that home secretary or this bit of the state.
Sure.
But this collective sense of losing faith in our political system. The public feel like there are massive problems and no one is up to the job of tackling them. That's quite a dangerous moment, potentially, isn't it?
Well, it is. And in a sense, you can see perhaps some of the difficulty this is causing our politicians in the election campaign. I mean, the question that's being asked about the Conservative Party is, well, look, you can say now you're going to reduce taxes, you say now you're going to reduce immigration, but should we believe you given your record? And this is where the lack of trust becomes a problem. But equally on the Labour side, a lot of people say, both as a result of focus groups and looking at the numbers, not that much enthusiasm for Labour as alternative, may be acceptable, but not necessarily going to be brilliant. And again, this perhaps reflects the mood. We really think our country is in trouble. We suspect that maybe, or we hope at least, that perhaps the Labour Party won't make quite such a mess and be in quite such difficulty as the current government appears to be. but we're not entirely sure because, again, are they in the end perhaps promising more than they can deliver? And it's certainly, as it were, there's something of a suspension of disbelief about what the next government will look like if indeed it is a Labour government. I mean, beyond that, I mean, I guess, there are then bigger questions. One is, will it depress turnout? Well, maybe a bit, but I don't think it's going to be the principal problem. It certainly does potentially add fuel to the arguments about changing our constitution. We've got on a measure that actually tends not to get particularly high level support for changing our electoral system for the House of Commons. We've now got another increase. It's now continuing to run over 50%. And it's people who I don't trust politicians who are more likely to be wanting to look for the change in the rules. Seemingly support for English devolution's gone up. Again, the pandemic may play a role there. And also, I mean, I don't want to push this too far, but again, there's some evidence that perhaps there is that for some people, their lack of trust in politicians does feed into a sense of populism, the sense that at the end of the day, there's a political elite up there who are not really taking notice of the wisdom of ordinary people, combined with big business. You get some of that in the rhetoric of Nigel Farage and reform. Now, and we're not saying directly that this is a reason why reform are doing what they're doing, but certainly you can see that we did happen to have a measure of where people stand on some of these. I mean, to be honest, quite a lot of people say that, they express views which appear to be pretty populist, but it's certainly particularly prevalent against those who, not surprisingly, don't trust our politicians. So in a sense, I guess, I think one crucial message is, whoever forms the next government, yes, you've got to fix the public services. Yes, you've got to fix the economy. And both of those will help to restore faith in politics. But you've probably also got to work on restoring faith in you, certainly as a government, and perhaps also for whoever forms the opposition, that there is a job to be done in the light of the political turmoil of, arguably since 2016, certainly since 2019, there is a job there to persuade people that, as it were, we can, as a country, govern ourselves reasonably well, ethically and efficiently. And about those things at the moment, there's a degree of doubt.
And actually, that sort of takes us almost back to where we started, where the fact that the biggest rise in disenchantment is amongst Leave voters. The country was split down the middle 8 years ago over the question of Leave and Remain. It was the big defining message of the 2019 general election: get Brexit done. And yet, in this election campaign, it's almost totally absent. Michael Heseltine, former Deputy Prime Minister, warned the campaign will be the most dishonest in modern times because no one is talking about it. It's the big split in our politics. It's the big driving factor of people's anger, and yet no one's talking about it.
Indeed. Well, of course, the Labour Party back in 2020 made the judgment that they wouldn't possibly be able to win an election unless they particularly reconnected with those who are in favour of Brexit. In the event that assumption has proven to be false, the Labour Party has managed to get way ahead in the opinion polls, even though actually, as again our report shows, and polling evidence also is consistent with this more recently, that once you start looking who supports Conservative, who supports Labour, actually the link between people's attitudes towards Brexit and who they're going to support is very clearly there. You still got around 50% of those people who want to be outside the European Union, saying that they regard themselves as a Conservative supporter, and 50% of those are on the Remain side, saying that they support Labour. So the divide is there. But I think what this report also comes up with, and again, it feeds into this argument about cultural issues, about woke and anti-woke, is that the arguments about so-called cultural or identity issues, these are now more clearly related to how people vote, particularly if you take into account not just Conservative and Labour, but Reform, the Greens and the Liberal Democrat. And it is quite striking. If we go back to 2015 and just take as an example the issue of immigration. Yes, then it was somewhat true that people who thought the immigration wasn't good for the country were rather more likely to vote for Conservative, or at that time UKIP, and that those who were at the other end of the debate about immigration were more likely to vote Labour or Democrats. But we're talking about kind of 20-point differences. Now the differences in terms of party support, according to your views about immigration, are about twice as big as that. And that to that extent, at least, and that's just one example. It's also true, the arguments about transgender, for example. There is now a sharper relationship between our views on cultural identity issues than was true before Brexit. And Brexit, which, was always part of that debate, it's not just, as it were, a separate issue. It's also been a harbinger of a wider set of issues coming into our politics. It's not that the left-right divide has disappeared, but of course, it's the left-right divide on which both the Conservative and the Labour Party, at least, are more comfortable talking about. Whereas for Reform and for the Greens, arguably, it's the cultural and identity issues which prove to be more important. But we are now, as a society, one where, and it's true in this, I'm not suggesting to you that Brexit explains why the Labour Party is where it is. That isn't the case. The truth is the mistakes and the difficulties that have beset this government, arguably some of them not of its own making, but some of them of their own making, that in the end, it's those issues which have driven the dynamics of party support, but the structure of who is more likely to vote Conservative, who is more likely to vote Labour, who is more likely to Reform, who is more likely to vote Liberal Democrat. That structure is still very clearly there. Brexit is part of that structure, as are culture and identity issues more broadly. And to that extent, at least now as a society, we are not just arguing about inequality and left-right issues, we're also arguing about culture, identity, etc.
Let's end on a more positive note, John. In a minute, we're going to hear from some other people for their ideas about how to fix our politics.
Sure.
Really interesting. More than half now say the voting system should change so that smaller parties get a fairer share. Almost half of those in England believe that there should be an English parliament. So, is that something that you think? Is it just politicians maybe under promising and over delivering for a bit and not having loads of drama? What do you think? What's the way to fix the system, do you think?
Well, in part, of course, it is about personal behavior. I think one of the difficulties with the whole Brexit debate was the way in which sometimes convention, understandings, etc., were not adhered to, and that we've entered a rather more robust political era where politicians seem to be willing. I'm not picking out anybody in particular or any particular one side, but there is perhaps a greater tendency of politicians now to want to be able to pursue arguments that they think will win them votes without necessarily always being thinking about, well, is this a part of the game? Is it good for our politics in general that perhaps we ride roughshod over conventions, etc., that what perhaps we are inclined to exaggerate arguments? Now, disinformation has always been there in our politics. Remember the Zinoviev letter of 1924. But I think, shall we say, one way of putting it, maybe we could do with a few more gentlemen in our politics and rather fewer players.